to end up, I actually wanted to also really focus on three things today. I was worried a bit about being a bit like the Dan Aykroyd character. As soon as you start talking about investments, you start sounding a bit more like Dan Aykroyd, and that's not where I want to go with this. I wanted to speak about hopeful things, actually, almost a bit about that vision of change. And I wanted to do it in threes. Well, actually, I wasn't sure if the saying is that bad things come in three or good things come in three. I feel pretty safe in a Christian gathering saying good things come in three. So we'll go with that. And the first one, of course, is to talk about three things which are really indicative that that shift is underway, that the world is changing, and some good things happening there. I want to talk about three external developments, that things will help us as communities and as investors to address climate change, and then maybe three things that, from the investment side, that communities are doing to try to push that change along. So first of all, just on the idea that change is underway, one thing which I just learned in the last while and I thought was brilliant was the International Energy Agency put out an evaluation of the greenhouse gas emissions over the past, well, many, many years, 60 years or so. And it showed a really interesting thing on this bar graph they put out. It showed that for the last 2 years, greenhouse gas emissions have flattened. And this is really interesting because, well, maybe it could be run-of-the-mill in that it's happened before. They showed another 2 or 3 instances where it's happened before. One was during the Great Depression, one was in around 2000, and one was around 2008. All of these were times when economic activity slowed, and therefore greenhouse gas emissions also slowed. There wasn't as much production going on, and therefore, naturally, the emissions went down. The last 2 years are different because GDP actually went up by about 3.4% in 2014 and 3.1% in 2015. GDP goes up, greenhouse gas emissions flatten. That's incredible. That's a big change. And they attributed it, more importantly, to the rise of renewable energy. That is, the amount of use of renewable energy and energy efficiency. So it's actually because we're doing something right. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to continue that way. It doesn't mean we've won the battle. Okay, let's go home. We go home soon. But no, we have lots to do. But it's a very positive sign. And in fact, the second thing was to look at country-level things. We now have this global agreement on climate change, but countries have to do things themselves. They have to actually have a plan to achieve that. And the great thing about that is you look at a country like Germany, who I think 15 years ago, 6% of their power came from renewable sources. It's now up at 30%. That's a pretty big change in a short period. It means that it's possible to do that, and even more so now, because the technologies are available and the price on those technologies is so different. And I'll come to that in a minute. And the last thing on hopeful things to show that shift is underway is, and I have to say it is China, because that's always been under the Harper government. That was always the boogeyman in the room. Oh, we can't do anything because China's not going to do it. China's terrible. China's doing all this. Well, actually, China is on target to meet its targets for greenhouse gas reductions, both for 2020 and 2030. In fact, ahead of time. This is really important because they've been seen as the biggest market in the world for coal and the biggest growth of coal burning power plants, and that's changing. And that's partly why we're seeing such a dramatic decline in the coal industry, because they can't rely upon China to burn that stuff anymore. That's huge, and that's going to be very important. Okay, second thing, 3 external developments that help us as investors to adapt to this shift. First of all, the investments in renewable energy that I talked about that have made that change as far as greenhouse gas emissions. A couple of stats on that. In 2014, investments in renewable energy increased 17% to about $270 billion, and they, more importantly, represent about 58% of new additions to global power capacity. That is, more additions in renewable energy than in fossil fuels. Again, first time that's ever happened. That's huge. And we've exceeded the earlier projections of how fast that would go by huge amounts, about 15 times in wind energy, like we're 15 times further ahead than all predictions said we'd be at this point, and more than 17 times in terms of energy, solar power globally. So again, we're actually doing a rapider shift, which is also really important. And why this is important for investors is because it gives us opportunities. The more this grows, and the bigger the growth in renewable energy, the more investment grade opportunities there are for you to participate in this and invest in it. Because before, a lot of the times we talked about investment in renewable energy, it was often in very small startup companies, which you didn't know whether it was going to go well or not, and you were being asked to shift your investments from blue chip energy company to something which is much more risky. That's changing. Another thing I think is quite positive is the Financial Stability Board, which is a global board set up with the chair, Mark Carney, our former Bank of Canada governor. It's a global cooperative agency between governments, which was set up to look at financial stability in the system. It set up a sustainability task force to look at how to do disclosure around greenhouse gas and climate issues. And so that's came up with a report just last week, I believe, which is the first of a report to look at a framework for that. And they're asking for consultation on this, and we'll come back with recommendations by the end of the year. This is good because it's at a global level. It's by a very credible source, and it drives that possibility to change not only in governments but with companies. And the third thing I think, which is really good for external development, which would help us along this path, are the new funds that have been growing up. There have been a huge growth. Almost every week I hear about some new fund coming out, which is a fossil-free fund, or some ability to do a green investment, some of which I think is greenwashing, much of which is actually fairly well thought out. We work on behalf at Share. We work on behalf of a company called Genesis Capital Management, which has a whole family of fossil-free investment vehicles, which has been great. And one of the things I really like is they've got what they call, I think, the fossil-free impact equity fund. And this is one which doesn't just look at how to get fossil fuel companies out of the portfolio, but how to invest in companies which are driving change. That is, doing better things for water improvements, for new technologies which are green in nature, or actually aren't just getting rid of bad stuff, but are actually promoting good stuff. To put it in really simple terms, I think that's great, and there's so much more coming out of that the opportunities are much higher than they have been. Now, what do we do with that? So 3 things that have been done, which I think are interesting. We talked, I think last time you met, about carbon footprinting and how that was important for portfolios. And a lot of energy has been going into this idea we will measure the carbon footprint of our portfolio. How much greenhouse gases do we see from the companies and the assets in our portfolio on an annual basis? And that's a really good step to take, because it gives you a sense of where you stand on things as a fund. But it's really important to think what you do with that information, because it's not about just saying, okay, well, now we were here, we got this much greenhouse gas emissions, we're gonna just try to get it here. That's not bad, but it's not really getting at the heart of it, because you might be dropping a fairly strong player in one industry because it looks bad in its greenhouse gas emissions, but has all sorts of other good values. It's really good on water or other things, without really understanding what the company does. What's been more interesting is to take an example like what the California Public Employees Retirement System, which is one of the biggest pension funds in the world. It's got about $293 billion. They did this carbon footprinting mechanism with the 11,000 companies in their portfolio. And what they found is that they would then focus their efforts on 80 of the companies in that portfolio that had the biggest emissions. They didn't drop them. What they said is, okay, now we're going to go in there, we're going to figure out how to change that picture. We're going to go in and engage those companies about what is it about their operations that makes them such a problem. You can use it also, of course, to screen companies that are similar. Like this company, we have 2 grocers. One is better than the other one. Which one do we choose? Well, we try to go for reward the one with the lower emissions. The second thing, which I talk about a lot, is the engagement side, and I want to speak about that. Some initiatives have been taken recently, which I thought were quite good by various investors around the world. First is, we've seen this last year by the church in England about pushing companies on a 2-degree scenario. That is, Shell and BP were asked to figure out what their businesses look like if governments kept true to what's being negotiated in Paris. That's grown. 75 investors have filed proposals at 45 of the largest fossil fuel companies to stress test what they're doing in a 2-degree world. And there's one here in Canada this year at Suncor. So if anyone does still hold Suncor in the portfolio, their annual general meeting is coming up in a few days, and we're hoping to see a vote of almost 100% in favor of that. The board has actually supported it, so I expect we'll get a very high support for that. Now, I don't know where that goes. We have to follow up on that, because it's nice to say, oh yeah, we're going to stress test, we're going to see how it looks. but there's a lot more to go from there. It's just a great baseline to work from. Some of the more interesting things, speaking to Bullfrog Power, which Janet mentioned, there have been pushes by investors in the States, particularly from religious investors, to get companies to adopt renewable energy commitments so that they're buying from companies like that, so that they they shift how they're buying power. And so you've gotten giant companies like Walmart, Google, IBM make large commitments to buy from renewable energy sources. And again, that creates more of a cascading effect of opportunities and builds that renewable power capacity. I'm going to talk lastly about policy, because I think we were talking about that, about how do you influence governments, and it's really important that we get that kind of support from government for this shift. Today there was a release of a letter signed again by religious investors and others with about $3.5 or $3.6 trillion in assets, congratulating the US and Canadian governments on targeting methane emissions, one of the biggest contributors to climate change. I think it's 86 times as powerful a greenhouse gas in the short term, and so something we have to tackle quickly. It's been good to see some commitments to action on that, so they wanted to support that and say this is positive for us as investors. Speaking as investors, it's one thing to go to speak to your MP as a community of voters, which is key, but it's also useful to speak and have dialogue with the decision makers as investors. We had a meeting just recently with the Environmental Commission of Ontario, who asked for a meeting with a large group of investors, all Bay Street types down there, to give them some advice on what can the government do to enhance this motion towards climate change awareness amongst investors and change in the investment practices. And I think it was one of the more positive meetings we've seen with them. From all that, I suppose we can advocate for better climate-related disclosures, so we can do things like carbon footprinting, better instructions to pension trustees that are appointed by the government, and doing market-wide studies of the risks so we get a better sense of how to, or better agreement on what needs to be done. And lastly, I guess we want to grow the tent of active investors. That is, we think there's a lot of capital out there that could be put to use changing this world. A lot of weight that could be added to our voices on this from other pension funds, foundations, and others that have large investments that should be playing a role in this, and other churches for that matter. We're meeting, I was up in Ottawa about 2 weeks ago, meeting with the Department of Finance about instituting new rules around disclosure on environmental investing for pension funds regulated federally. In a couple of weeks, I'll go be meeting with the Minister of Finance in Alberta to speak about the same thing. And I think there's a lot of interest now at the governments to try to unlock some of this potential. And you can be part of that. It doesn't matter if you're a small fund or a big fund. There's lots of opportunities to do things collaboratively, almost the way we're doing this here with GEM, speaking collaboratively. How do we use our work together to advance this through our investments? It's not the answer on its own. The political side, the personal side, the community side, and the active side is absolutely critical, but we can align our investments with that as well. And hopefully we can help you do some of that.